Hello and welcome indeed to this kick-off debate in the Centre for Cultural Values' first ever Festival of Ideas. And I can't say how welcome you all are and how very pleased we are to have you on Zoom with us. So I'm Anne Torrigiani. I am CEO of the Audience Agency, the National Charity for Cultural Participation and Engagement, but I am also, and more importantly today, the co-director for the Centre for Cultural Value. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our contributors for today's debate, to whom I am incredibly grateful for their support in taking part in this big moment for us as we really go public with our new programme. So thank you very much indeed to Elie Bellafiore, who'll be chairing us, to Rabab Ghazal, Harry Josephine Giles, Tony Cherry Batang and Dadi Raitopo, who are our very esteemed guests. And as I say, thank you very importantly as well to all of those of you who are joining us. I think that Ellie's going to do all the necessary housekeeping with you in a moment. So I'm just going to kick off really to say, apart from saying thank you, but also just a quick moment about the centre and how we can all hopefully work together. So I just want to say really that our purpose as Research Centre is to really build a shared understanding of how and why taking part in cultural activity makes a difference to our people's lives and to society more widely. So why bother? I mean, we know it does, right? But I suppose that our purpose as a centre is to go beyond the exception that it does and to make sure that developments in cultural practice and cultural policy are really based on rigorous and I think suitably nuanced research and evidence, which takes account of the perspectives of many different stakeholders and of the complexity and richness of the cultural experience. So we're funded for 5 years. We're very grateful to AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, to Arts Council England, and to the Paul Hamlyn Foundation for their foresight and generosity in funding the centre. And I suppose most importantly, though, I just want to say to talk very briefly about how we can benefit you. So you might be thinking about how you better evaluate the impact of your work. You might be thinking about how you can use research insights and critical reflection as a practitioner or within your organisation. You might be an academic who wants to engage with cultural organisations in your research. You might be making decisions about funding or what gets public recognition. In all of these cases, hopefully we are going to be here to support you. And most importantly, I think, to act as a conduit to help us all work together across what have been traditional divides between the different areas of our work. How are we going to be doing that? Well, we're going to be sharing both an overview and some of the detail of a lot of different research. There's a lot of very rich research out there, of course, as we already know. Sometimes it's just difficult to navigate, and we see our job as helping you to do just that. So we're going to be showing you to the research insights through a range of different digests, which I think are going to be super useful, through lots of lovely free online resources, through events like these ones. We will also be funding some research collaborations, especially where they can fill some of the gaps in that existing research. Later on in the programme, towards the end of the 5 years, we're going to be doing a MOOC, which will be really thinking about how we use data as within the cultural sector. And of course, all the way along, there will be lots of opportunities to debate, discuss, be together, to listen to each other and exchange through the programme, just like I hope today will be. So we're very keen to get your evaluation because we want to know how it works. As a centre, we really want to be a place of gathering rather than a sort of a thing that does things to people. So really important that you get a chance to join in today and feel that we're listening to you. So I invite you to enjoy the rest of the session today and do please keep in touch with us and spread the word. So can I, Ellie, hand over to you, the chair for our session. What value culture? It's your life's work. Please tell us all about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, and welcome everybody to this event, which is part of the What Cultural Value series, which you can find online. I'm Eleonora Bellafiore, although most people call me Ellie, so feel free to address me as that. I'm a professor at Loughborough University, and I am a cultural policy scholar interested in the politics of funding and those interesting gaps between policy rhetoric and what really happens to the money. And I found that looking at the practices of money distribution is a good way to really get to the bottom of what we as a society seem to value. And part of my research has been highlighting that not everybody's culture is equally valued and considered when it comes to how much of what proportion of the funding it receives. So yes, pretty much what value culture is, the condensed topic of my life's work. So it's very exciting to have the opportunity to chair this fabulous panel. Now I can see that there's a lot of activity in the chat. So if you haven't, but there's also a lot of us. So if you haven't yet, please use the chat to say hello and introduce yourself. This is meant to be as much a networking opportunity as just an event. We have a live transcriber for the session. So you can either use the CC button to turn on captions on Zoom, or if you prefer, you can use the stream text link which was posted in the chat and which the team has just posted again. So just click on that. So just to confirm, we will be recording the session, and I saw there was a question about this earlier in the chat, in the chat. So if you do not want to be seen or heard, then please turn your camera and microphone off. We will not be sharing the chat publicly, so even if you don't want to be recorded, you can still engage actively through the chat. So we will have breakout groups, which the working on which I will explain later, and those won't be recorded. So that's another opportunity for you to be able to contribute freely. So we want the session to be as interactive as we can make it with the restriction of Zoom and not actually being in a room together, which would be, of course, the ideal. So what we'll do is we will be hearing from our speakers, and then we will have plenty of opportunities for questions throughout. Because there is so many of us today, this afternoon, which is great, and just so that I can keep track of things, please only post your questions in the chat when I ask you to do so, so I can keep an eye and track them. As I said, we'll do a short breakout session in the middle to give you a chance to interact and bring something to the conversation. And after the session, if you have given us approval to share your contact details, we will do that with all those who have booked, so that we can hopefully continue some of the conversations that start here also post the event. So I will now pass over to our contributors to hear their thoughts on today's central questions. And the questions that we had posed to our contributors and asked them to reflect on were: who and what defines dominant ideas of cultural values in the UK, and how can this change? Who is producing culture and how might this evolve? What types of cultural participations are hidden from view? And what can a reshaped understanding of cultural value look like? So, easy questions for a Monday afternoon, but they've done a great job. So let me briefly introduce them to you. We have Rabab Ghazul, who's an artist, curator and founder director of Cardiff-based Gentle Radical. Harry Josephine Giles, who is a Scottish writer and performer. Toby Cherimateng, excuse me, who's an award-winning cultural producer and social entrepreneur. Daddy Wright Topo, who's a community leader from Welsh House Farm in Birmingham, and she's the lead for the Hard Times Require Furious Dancing CCC project in Birmingham, which I think has got to be the best named project I've ever come across. So they'll speak briefly just for 3 minutes, just to give us some provocations, and then I'll start the discussion off with some questions, and then there'll be room for you to also ask a panelist some questions. So Rabab is going to start us off. So Rabab, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm not going to be able to cover all of that, and I'm also going to read from my notes, so I try and stick to time. Thank you, Ellie. So I wanted to just start by asking a question about value. I mean, we're talking about cultural value. How do we ask a question about what it is that is valuable to us, what we value? And I think deep down, what we value is to be able to lead a dignified life. When we talk about wanting a fair and a just and an equitable society, we essentially mean everyone being able to lead a dignified life, having the same access to opportunities to flourish, to reveal our potential, to lead a thriving life. Of course, this isn't the society we live in. The society we live in upholds multiple forms of systemic abuse and violence, which essentially prevent most people on this planet leading a dignified life. And our cultural systems reflect and replicate and uphold that state of affairs. Those cultural systems are all too often hierarchical, are elitist, are racist, ableist, colonial, extractive. They're systems that have historically centered the superiority of maleness, whiteness, Europeanness, and power resides in institutions who essentially decide on the canon, on programs, on who is visible, who gets to advance within those systems, how cultural objects and outputs are read, and their meaning, and what that meaning is worth, and how that meaning can be capitalized and commodified. So cultural value is phenomenally prescribed in a way that serves the needs of those who already hold power and seek to maintain it. And I'd say as someone who works within social practice and participatory and cultural models, we can see that operating just as much within those spaces. More often than not, we see that within our engagement and access and inclusion industries, we see artists being parachuted in and out of communities who are described in, yet again, incredibly patronizing terminology, communities in need who are deprived or disadvantaged. We see those models where complex consortia of partners gaining access often to eye-watering amounts of funding, deliver projects, again, in communities, with an assumption that somehow culture is going to be able to better people in some way, or address social problems, or share with them something that they don't already have. I think these models ignore the wealth of culture that already exists. They ignore our multiplicity, our ancestry, the complexities of who we are and what we do, the different ways in which we create and are creative, and the complex heritages and practices that we share. So much of which remains invisible, isn't sanctioned often by mainstream art spaces or cultural institutions. And instead we maintain within our cultural systems what are invariably deeply colonial processes. Every time we use a community for a temporary token moment as a way of tick boxing our engagement work, we are using people as a means, as a resource. And as long as we're using people as a means, we are extending and are engaged in the colonial project. So largely, to end, cultural value is constructed, it's conferred upon us, it's dictated to us, it's not decided by us, and it sits above the value of human beings. We have to literally step over the bodies of migrants, the homeless, the poor, on our way to our cultural spaces, our opera houses, our concert halls and galleries. Suzanne Dhaliwal, a climate activist and artist, recently asked, what would it mean for Tate Modern to just sell a couple of those masterpieces in order to keep staff in work, to not have to put swathes of people out of work and lay people off? Why is it unthinkable for institutions to do this? And I think the answer to that tells us something about how we construct and uphold cultural value.
Thank you very much, Rabab. Quite powerful 3 minutes. So next we have Toby Cherimateng talking about her own experience. Are you there, Toby?
Yeah.
Perfect. The floor is yours.
Cool. I'm just going to time myself. So whenever conversations around culture come up, I really struggle to engage in these conversations. And I think a lot of that is largely due to how culture is defined in these contexts. And I think that's something that's really important to specify. I think often when we speak about culture, we speak about the institution of culture, the institution of the arts, as opposed to the cultures that are inherent to us, what we grow up with, what we know in our households. And often when we talk about culture and the introduction of culture to communities, we frame it in a way as if it's something that the institution has to introduce to certain communities that are quote unquote hard to reach, quote unquote underrepresented, etc. And for a long time, I felt really uncomfortable with this idea of being introduced to culture in this way. If I think back to my early experiences of theatre, I think about the multiplicity of stories that my parents have of growing up in Ghana and Nigeria. I think about them sitting us down and telling us these stories, whether it was to tell us off, to teach us some sort of life lesson. I grew up in a household of storytellers. And then I stepped into an institution that told me that they were the ones that introduced this culture to me. How does that make people feel when it comes to engaging in these spaces? How does that contribute to quote unquote imposter syndrome, which is a very colonial thing that is often kind of into something that's their problem? How does this contribute to the feeling of not belonging in certain spaces? And how are these remnants of a colonial history of the way that the arts as an institution has been co-opted by whiteness, by the West, etc. So something I really want to engage in this conversation is, when we talk about culture, what are we talking about specifically? Are we talking about the institution of culture that we contribute to? Are we talking about the cultures that exist outside of the institution that people grow up with that maybe aren't recognized by said institutions or by the mainstream? What is this obsession we have with introducing people to said culture? Why do you believe that you are the person to do that, or you are the organization or the people to do that? What do you have that you think other people don't? What makes you so special? I think all of these questions for me really really pinpoint what exactly it is that we're talking about when it comes to making any sort of change across our sector, across our society. I think we have to start at the very basis of that, which is defining exactly what it is we mean. That is 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Toby. Another powerful 3 minutes. So impressive how you're all managing to fit so much in your 3 minutes. And I'm sure that Dadirai Topo, who is a community leader from a Welsh House Farm in Birmingham and generally a ball of energy, will be able to do as much. So Dadirai, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Ellie. I live and work in my community of Welsh House Farm. And I relate to what Toby has said. I originally came from Zimbabwe, where we were surrounded by a lot of traditions and cultural activity. But on coming here, there was this pressure on people saying, we want to introduce culture to you, almost assuming that I didn't have any culture with me to start with. I'm just a microcosm of what the sort of communities we live in are. I live in what the world would call deprived communities, but I don't call it that. We call ourselves difficult to ignore communities, because that's what we are. No matter how much we try and talk about other things, you cannot miss us, because we are there. We may be ignored for a few times, but we're there. Within this context of this discussion, I find myself not being the only one wondering why culture has to be introduced to people as well. You know, as a community worker, the biggest asset in our communities are the people who live within that community. They are the biggest asset. They are the first and foremost, and they are at the very core of what they do. There's a lot of cultural value within our communities. We're a very diverse set of communities, Birchfield and Welsh House Farm and others that may not be talked about today. But their cultural worth is never something that is up on the TV or showcased. it's because they also don't have the enough clout to attract the right funding, to be in the right spaces. And it is a colonial project when it's assumed that because people are poor and are not middle class and are not white, therefore either they don't have a culture or their culture is not worth talking about. The amounts of monies that are circulating within the same sort of cultural organizations is staggering, bearing in mind that some of us are so short of money, but with such cultural richness that needs to be recognized. It needs to be promoted, it needs to be showcased, people need to be nurtured within this culture to make it the diverse culture that people seem to talk about. There's no recognition or celebration of difference and diversity, despite the rhetoric that we are used to now. So people talk about the trickle down theory, or the funds will trickle down. Usually funds trickle down to communities such as ours in a sort of a CSR sort of thing. Oh, as a corporate social responsibility, we did this art project with Welsh House Farm. It shouldn't be like that. We should be genuine partners in the cultural celebration and cultural nurturing of this country, of these communities. But we are not. We are not even at the table. Our CCC project is rooted in a resident-led philosophy. It puts the residents at the core, and the voices from the bottom inform the top. And this is what we're advocating for, really, a recognition that comes from the grassroots. So experts, those so-called experts being parachuted in that Rabab talked about, they are coming on tap and never on top. That gives us a chance to recognize, to showcase, and to nurture talent at the local level, to really treat communities, no matter who they are, with the respect that they deserve, with the recognition that they should have, so that they are showcased in the media and in the cultural sector organizations, and even in the, dare I say, central government. Because otherwise, without that, there's just not enough to go around, and we are never seen. We are almost invisible. So the lens I'm coming with is all culture is valuable, the diversity of it all. But unfortunately, the funding bit of it and the recognition bit of it is in a few hands, the same few hands that it has had all over again. When I was in Africa, the same hands were ruling that cultural sector, even in my country. And I come here, the same few hands are still ruling that sort of funding process. It almost treats it's a colonial project. It treats those in hard to ignore places like ours as if they're being colonized. That's wrong. And I think something should change. I think all of us have got a role to play, academia, the media, the government itself, to change the face of the cultural sector so that it becomes more representative of the communities that it seeks to work with. We want to be genuine partners. We want to be taken seriously. We want to be valued. And we also want to be allowed to showcase the talent in our own terms. We don't want to be told what to do. We already know. Residents are experts in their own lives. That is the lens I'm coming through. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to you, Dadirai. And we conclude with Harry Josephine's perspective. And we are running a few minutes late, but what we'll do after Harry Josephine has started, I'll ask a couple of questions, but I'm keen that even if we're running late, there's space for you to ask questions. So have a think, because I will soon be inviting you to put questions in the chat, but please wait until I ask you so I can keep track. So Harry Josephine, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks to everyone who's spoken already. They're all such important things to be working with and responding to. And I want to draw a little bit on what's already been said, which in a number of different ways is just that the problem isn't that there's not enough culture. The problem is who's getting paid to make culture. The problem isn't art, it's how the resources for art and life are distributed. And I think my perspective on that, and this is coming particularly from a disabled perspective, but a number of different ones at once, is that that's not like that's not a mistake. Like that's not art working wrong. That's art doing what it's supposed to do. That's art functioning as a system that it's been designed to do. I have, at this point, after like, I don't know, a decade and a half of working professionally in art, like developed a tremendous hostility towards art and culture as a concept. Because I can't see it as anything other than the accumulation of resources towards the top. Some examples of what I mean by that is that visual art is primarily a resource for rich people to invest in and increase the value of, to increase the value of their investment. Like that's what the visual art system is set up to do. The arts funding system, as it currently exists, is a means of regressively taxing the public, because Britain has an extraordinarily regressive taxation system that taxes working class incomes much higher than it taxes upper class incomes, ruling class incomes. So it's a regressive taxation system that funnels money towards middle class and white and cis heterosexist and able-bodied art and institutions, both the people who are making it and the type of art that is funded. It's a system of funneling resources towards that. And that's what art and cultural value are in terms of dominant culture, in terms of government funding. And that's also what they're supposed to be. That art is a power structure doing what it sets out to do. So I think when we consider alternatives to that, we have to consider not trying to give all of us here access to the thing that already exists. And I'm using access in a disabled term, but rather changing the thing that exists. We're not going to solve the problem by giving us more access to it, just as the problem isn't that there's not enough culture. The problem isn't that there's not culture in working class communities. It's that the culture that is already made in working class communities doesn't get funded properly, doesn't get paid properly, and people are left in degraded social conditions. So that's kind of how I would diagnose things. And the reason I say that this is from a disabled perspective, I'm going to cut that because I just did 3 minutes. I'll talk more about that another time if there's time. That's my alarm too. So there you go.
So it's okay. Thanks, Harry, Jasmine, especially because we are indeed running a little bit late. So we'll just have maybe a question or two, but I know that the team are keen that we introduce the breakout question session at 2:35 punctually, which leaves us with 5 minutes, which with all that you have given us, it is quite challenging. So maybe forgive me if I adapt one of the the questions I had in mind for one of you to be open up to all of you. So I think you've all made really compelling arguments for how contemporary arts practice, the funding process mechanisms are extractive, exclusionary and representative, make all sorts of assumptions about who needs to be taken to culture because there somehow doesn't count. So we, as a way to also ease us into the question that people will be exploring in their breakout groups. So what would a non-extractive, exploitative, inclusive and representative form of practice look like? And what kind of support infrastructure do you think we need to be able to get there? And I know that is $1 million question, so I don't think that anybody expects us to sort it out in 4 minutes. But does any of you want to get us started in terms of thinking, okay, so this is a picture of the problem, so what do we do? Some concrete, concrete suggestion for different ways of working that might take us closer to this kind of picture for an alternative way of doing things that I think is emerging from your presentations.
I'm happy to briefly kind of suggest, and this is nothing new, but it probably needs to happen a lot more, is parachuting in and out of this whole model of brevity in a way, and the brief engagement of communities. I think that the whole premise of that needs to change into how do we work with hyper local models of cultural practice that are permanent? What does it mean to imagine cultural projects that are 10 or 20 or 30 years long, which don't involve individual artists, as people have already said, as speakers have said? It's not about how do we bring artists in. The artists are often already in those communities. How do you fund properly the cultural ecology of those spaces in those neighborhoods so you eradicate the idea of engagement because people are permanently engaging themselves, and funding exists to enable that to consistently happen.
Thank you, Rabab. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on, if they could recommend one step towards a better system, what would it be? Anyone who wants to jump in?
Sure. Two of us are muted at once. So, Dara, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is we're very keen to make sure that the cultural sector, whether it be statutory bodies, the government departments, they should be truly representative, have a diversity of people that have power and clout, that can speak on behalf of the community. So it is to actually sort of change the makeup of the system right now, so that we have people who are sympathetic and are understanding of what is existing in the grassroots, because there's no need for someone who has no appreciation for cultural activity that is different from what we have already termed white middle class to even recommend that they be funded. So the whole system needs to change. The media needs to also be showcasing that different thing, and the museums need to take a different look at what they are exhibiting, for instance, the sort of shows that they are promoting, so that it also shows the diversity of the UK as we stand. And that is critical, because unless that happens, the current system, which isn't working, will continue.
So, Harry Josephine, you wanted to comment, how do we make them?
I think all the solutions are already out there. Like, I've been, like most of the people here, I've been to like 1 million panel discussions and conversations where we all diagnose the problem and then pretend that the solutions don't already exist. Sometimes I wonder if panel discussions aren't also like a mechanism for reproducing power and just having us like constantly talk about the same things instead of going to an organizing meeting. Like, and I that's a critique that I apply to myself as somebody that goes to too many panel discussions. I think from a worker perspective, like one of the solutions is joining a union and advocating for better wages and supporting the campaigns of unions for better wages. Or, as COVID-19 has really illustrated for us, unionization and worker organization doesn't always happen within those formal structures. It also happens within mutual aid networks. It also happens within community networks, but it means organizing with the people around you. That's how change happens. It's not through appealing to an institution of power, it's through organizing with the people in your immediate community, your immediate workplace, your immediate living situation, in order to improve the conditions that you're already in. But I can see from the chat that there's a whole bunch of people that are in leadership positions in organizations here, and that's nice. And it's really nice that everyone wants to come to like a left liberal discussion where we all like imagine revolutionary scenarios and then don't do anything about it. The one thing that I would recommend to anyone in a leadership position in an arts and cultural organization is that tomorrow you could implement a horizontal pay structure in your organization. You could reduce your own wages, and you could say everyone, from the people who clean the toilets to the people who commission a play, is paid the same rate. And if you did that tomorrow, all of this would change very, 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 very quickly.
Absolutely. Now, that's almost a challenge from Harry Josephine to all those with some authority and power in our group today, of which there are many, to sort of think about revolutionary scenarios and how we achieve them in the breakout groups. So let me just briefly explain how this is going to work. So the breakout session is only going to be 10 minutes long. So the focus here is on some quick fire, immediate responses to what you've heard. Also some opportunities to begin the kind of networking that and talking and engaging that will be required for change. And the goal of the breakup breakout group is to explore a particular question, which is, what will it take for things to change? So if we have started from what seems to be an emerging consensus that the current system doesn't work, and it doesn't work in a fundamental way, then we can't just, play around with the fringes of the current system. We really need a rethink and, I'm tempted to say, burn it all down and start again, which actually, as Harry Josephine was saying, is actually not as this, doesn't require the level of destruction that metaphor brings. So, please explore that question. What will it take to see real change happen, and what would a realistic next step be? So you will not have the question in the breakout group, so please try and remember it. I'll repeat it before we go. So looking at our tight schedule, we are due to be starting our conversation now. So I think I'll just I'll confess that there's lots of thoughts coming through, so I haven't managed to read through all of it. There was also some really interesting international comparison with Poland, and earlier on, in some of the earlier comments with Canada. So clearly lots happening in the chat. And one thing that I forgot to mention earlier on is that the chat will remain open for 10 minutes after we conclude the event, so that you can catch up with anything that, like me, you might not have been able to read and add your comments. So just looking at what you've been posting, there seem to be some points that have been discussed or came up in all of the group, and certainly the thing that seems to have emerged more powerful are questions of leadership, and how do you, how can the leadership of organization go from being, something that maintains the organization and its value to something that facilitates change? There were a lot of discussions around how boards of organizations can play a role in sort of enforcing a language change, a culture change, and also try to perhaps challenge some of the definition of quality and excellence that drive the sector. Although, of course, the problem remains is how to achieve more diverse boards, and what does it need to happen for that to be possible. Unsurprisingly, funding came up a lot, and the frustration with some of those requirements of quality and excellence, which have already hierarchies of values built in, so that if you have to fit within those understanding of what a good project is, when you want to challenge those hierarchical notions of value, you will always be at a disadvantage, which indeed is one of the issues. There were lots of really radical suggestions with regards to payment for different kind of artists working in different contexts, in different institutions, in different corners, if you like, of the art sector. And there's a group that mentions even that some campaigning organizations who use algorithms to work at salary based on a number of standard criteria that have to do with location and presumably local cost of life, caring responsibility needs. There's also a suggestion of horizontal pay. There's lots of radical suggestions, but again, the sense that it will be hard to get the people who have perhaps the more privileged position to buy into those radical ways of working. So there's clearly a lot there. And what I think it's really interesting, because the panelists were sort of we were giggling at the earlier on when we were sort of preparing for this, by suggesting that really all the interventions were a sort of way of, you know, calling for a radical revolution. But actually, there seems to be an appetite for this in the chat and in the audience. So there's a lot of talk about agitating. So Nicolas Chaud says we should agitate from within. There's lots of calls to mobilize, calls to push for change. So it seems that ultimately what Harry Josephine was saying earlier on, that starting from our immediate environment, our contacts, and just mobilize and get more active and activist in our everyday work might be the solution. And of course, there's lots of comments still coming. So I am struggling to keep track, and trying to summarize as more things come up. I think before we get started on your questions, so start thinking about what you'd like to ask the panel. So we'll start the audience question and answer session in just about 5 minutes. So start thinking of any questions, put them in the chat, and I will then read them out to the panelists. But I can't see them on my screen, but I'm assuming all our panelists are back. And so perhaps to get us back into the mood for the questions, I can go back to some of the questions I wanted to ask our speakers earlier when we were running out of time. We seem to have made progress with time and didn't, just to get us warmed up again after the break. Is that okay? So can I start with Toby? Is Toby with us? So Toby, I was wondering, as you were talking, what would it take, what changes would it take for you to feel that your culture, your heritage was indeed part of that culture that the institutions feel they need to introduce to people? Is there anything concrete that you could do so that you didn't feel that it was your community, that was under pressure to or was expected to engage and be taken to some other kind of culture? Is there anything that you can think of that would get rid of that feeling for you? Oh, is Toby with us? Or maybe I can ask the same question.
I'm here. I just couldn't unmute myself. The host.
Oh, sorry, Toby. Sorry, Toby. Then, floor is yours.
To be honest, I don't know if I'm particularly interested in having my definition of culture acknowledged by the institution. Like, my goal isn't like, oh, I really want the National to acknowledge me. Like, I don't really care. I think it's more about I think it's more outside of these institutions. So it's sort of about, if you're coming into my space, you need to acknowledge that I am the expert of this space and not you. You don't get to come in and define how we work here. You don't get to come in and say that we are doing culture wrong, or we're not doing arts right, or our practice is wrong. You are a guest in this space. And I think it's about acknowledging the expertise of those communities in these spaces, as opposed to sort of like saying, oh, you need to come into our institution and we'll be nice to you. It's sort of a bit like, cool, but I don't find that particularly interesting.
No, that's absolutely true. Is there though a hope or an ambition that maybe a few generations down the line, people from all of Britain might be looking at those national flagship organizations and really see them as reflecting their nation? Is that something that feels important, or do you think that quote has sailed and that there's no salvaging those institutions that are built on those kind of dominant values and colonial principles?
I think it's important in the context of like where our money is going as taxpayers. I don't think it's necessarily important in the context of representation. If you kind of look at the history of space making in the UK, and I'll talk specifically about Black communities because that's what I know, but we've always had this history of making space in outside of spaces that we didn't see fit across the board. So if you look at like pirate radio stations, for example, and the spaces that Black communities were forging just to play our own music, and then it became popular, and then the mainstream was like, oh, okay, we'll like co-opt this and buy into it. Like, we've always had this history of making spaces for ourselves where we have full control over, you know, what we do, how we do it, how we get people involved. I think, you know, my taxes are going to these organizations, so it's actually the bare minimum for them to represent me. Like it's a requirement. That's what they should be doing, and I don't feel like it's something that should be asked of. And so I think but I also have very low expectations of a lot of our industries. Like that is just how I feel. And so cool if we get to a point where these institutions are finally acknowledging the people that live on their doorstep, good for them. But I think actually more communities mobilizing and working together to create these spaces for ourselves that are fully nuanced and holistic to us and our lived experiences, where we can fully be the experts of these lived experiences. For me, that seems to be that's the next step for me. I think I'm really tired of trying to get institutions to do the bare minimum and to do the groundwork. And actually, I think that's where you get a lot of communities getting burnt out. I think that's where you get a lot of people just leaving the sector completely and just being like, I can't be bothered to do this anymore. And it's really sad to kind of see a lot of my friends and my peers say that they don't want to work here anymore because this isn't a space for them. And I don't think we can continue to expect people to continue to do this work. Like Harry Josephine was saying, this isn't the first time we're having this conversation. Why are we having it again? At some point, you've got to start doing the work yourself, right? And so I think I'm pushing more towards how do we co-create, co-design a space for ourselves that allow us to fully flourish in all of the ways that we know how, as opposed to sort of continuing to look up to the nationals and the institutions for, you know, the little bit of crumbs that they might give us at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Toby, for that sobering thought. And I think there's really no gravest and more serious indictment of the status quo than having a successful cultural producer, you know, a young generation, you know, a young cultural producer sort of feeling so disenfranchised and disenchanted with the system that really tells us that it's not working. So thank you very much, Toby. I would like now to open the floor to questions from the audience. So please put your questions in the chat. If you're addressing your questions to one of our panelists in particular, please say so I can ask the question to the right person. Going through the chat so far, there's an interesting question from Kathleen. What exactly does quality and excellence mean, and who is it judged by? Rightly, she says it's problematic because art and culture needs to encompass processes of experimentation, exploration, artists, communities, policies. So there's quite a lot going in there. Do any of our panelists have any thoughts on this that they might like to share? So maybe can I ask you, Harry Josephine, to comment on this, because you know these sort of questions seems to speak to your presentation and in those 15 years of experience that you were referring to in your bit. Can we envisage a sort of debate around quality and, you know, and how do we make decisions about funding that are fairer? Now, kind of baseline or some, you know, notion.
Yeah, I think it's irrelevant. I think we should just abandon quality and excellence as a metric of arts funding. I don't think it's useful to anyone. I think we spend more money trying to monitor quality and excellence than we save by only funding what's good. Like, I think if we got rid of all of that assessment and spent that money on £1,000 arts grants with no barrier of entry, we would have higher quality and more excellent art. And I think as long as we have a hierarchical funding system and a hierarchical art system that is centered on supposedly funding quality and excellence, which it doesn't,
So
and it's only ever going to reproduce what is considered excellent by whoever it is that's dominating in society. So yeah, I'm just uninterested in it. I don't see, and again, like, so okay, so I'm going to try and bring in the disability perspective here, which is that disabled people are definitionally, we are the people who can't or don't want to work within the labour system as it's currently organised. Like, that's how we're defined by government. And there's many other things that one of the other ways that we could define disability, but it is being prevented from working, being alienated from working, not functioning within work as it is currently presented to us. And one of the results of that is that disabled artists struggle ever to produce quality and excellence in the terms of art as it's currently funded. Not that our work isn't actually excellent, not that it's not often like more vibrant than what I might see at the National, for example. It's just that we can't produce excellence within the terms that we're given, because those terms require working within a system that systematically excludes disabled people and requires levels of work that also produce disability and chronic illness, whether it's through burnout or mental exhaustion or literally repetitive injuries because of the kinds of cultural practices which we fund, which produce disabled bodies. Like, so that's where that hostility comes from. And I just think from a practical perspective, if we didn't bother monitoring quality and excellence and we just gave people money without gatekeeping it so much, then we'd actually save money and produce better work.
So what criteria? So if we start from the acceptance that there'll be always more exciting project than there is money, and if we do away with creativity, so with quality and excellence as criteria for distribution of money, what alternative criteria or mechanisms would you suggest? And again, I'll see if other panelists have ideas on this.
Why have mechanisms? This is the last thing that I'm going to say. At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, Creative Scotland gave artists money with no barrier to entry. You just had to say, I'm an artist who's lost income, would you like some money? And then you got money. And yes, the money ran out, and yes, there were barriers to who got that, and yes, if you were online, you probably got in there quicker. But that meant that artists experienced, possibly for the first time in their lives, getting money without being required to perform for it. And I bet that situation produced better art than any monitored funding situation. And I also bet that it got to more people in marginalized groups, however we define marginalized, than other funding systems.
Well, I hope that somebody's keeping track of that to be able to make that point. Any other comments from our group whilst I have a look at the other questions? Lots of love and lots of agreement with you, Harris, Josephine, in the chat. And we've got a question. There was a question on the internet that was quite interesting. Julie says, no one seems to have mentioned the internet. How is the internet affecting creatives, producers of arts, audiences? I don't know if, Rabab, would you like to comment on that based on your practice in what's going on in Cardiff? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, Ellie, can you just, where was that? Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah, no, because of course the chat moves as people comment, but so Julie O'Neill said, no one seems to have mentioned the internet. How is the internet affecting creatives, producers of art, audiences, etc.?
I think it affects all of those people in very different ways. There was a huge kind of almost instant migration of vast numbers of people's work onto kind of online spaces and platforms at the beginning of the pandemic, which was really interesting in terms of, the need to just keep on producing, the need to constantly be a kind of site of production in our practice, instead of going, what is going on? What is this? How do we listen to what we need to do? How do we understand that this crisis is affecting people in vastly disproportionate ways? Who's getting left behind in those processes? And I suppose for us in Cardiff, I mean, we, you know, to kind of work in a really democratized way, just the time that you're spending on what I suppose words like outreach, which I don't particularly care for, but the so many of the people we work with literally in our own community with our own residents, the kind of multiple barriers those people experience to, let's say, rocking up to your mainstream cultural institutional spaces means that we're constantly in engagement with them. That's not something you can do on the internet. We don't necessarily speak to some of our audiences via Twitter, via Instagram. So there's a huge, you know, it's whatever is happening on the internet, and it's generative, and that's important in many ways, but it's another layer. It's another space of exclusion for huge numbers of people. And I'm not sure, I mean, obviously a lot of people are then talking increasingly about how does work get adapted, you know, for what might be spaces that we're in for quite a long time, i.e. not real life spaces. I think again that just kind of tinkers, the same fundamental problematics with the system exist, and I think all of these conversations really are like tinkering at on the surface or at the sides with what needs to fundamentally shift, which is it's all been covered by everyone else already, but these systems are not fit for purpose, and we will not survive them as a species. We won't survive these systems. So it's not about how we're gonna, we can talk about making culture more equitable and reach more people, but we have to make life fundamentally more equitable for everyone. It's the most urgent project on our planet, and it has been for centuries, but culture needs to come on the back of that project, not the other way around, because I think as long as that's the order in which we're doing things, people will always find a way to keep maintaining the spaces of power and privilege they have historically had access to, and that has to change, and it has to change immediately, because I mean the idea of the kind of, I mean actually what we saw within the kind of what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic and the huge kind of like proliferation of mutual aid groups. I mean, the fundamental notion of mutual aid is not some kind of temporary model where we're going to be able to deal with the crisis, a pandemic for a few months. We should be exploring fundamentally what it means to dismantle capitalist models and start to think about what does it mean to live sustainably, hyperlocally, microlocally, in cities and beyond cities, in our rural spaces. What does it mean to survive on this planet and address the disenfranchisement and the dispossession of vast numbers of people who also live in the spaces we're in, who actually, we need to change those systems. And then we will find ways of culture following. I don't think it's rocket.
Thank you, Rabab. I think there's one question that I would like to address to both our sort of artist and community representatives, so to Toby and Daddy Rai. So somebody is asking about those flagship cultural events which continue to be offered as strategic policies across the UK, so various capital cities of culture, but also creative people and places and various other sort of national schemes. What do you, Toby and Daddy Rai, feel would be a more valuable or sustainable way for independent artists, grassroots organizations to be involved? Or do you even feel that those artists and communities would want to be involved with those big schemes? So Daddy Rai, do you want to get us started on this?
Yes, thanks, Ellie. I think communities, grassroots communities already have a lot of cultural activities happening, at their levels. When these other flagship national sort of initiatives come, we are almost asked to fit within their structures. It's almost like it's a one size fits all, but it doesn't work with us. We already have a lot going on in our communities that needs its own showcasing. You know, it needs to be showcased on its own, and that is where the problem is. We are mostly told, oh, can you do something that fits within the criteria that has been written somewhere, a criteria that is embedded within a system that is not working, that is not fit for purpose, that we have already said is not resident-led at its core, because that's the sort of way we work. And an initiative that is very top-down and it's disrespectful to the cultural equity or cultural richness that already is in our communities. So therein lies the problem. For maybe struggling, community organizations who may think, oh, let's just follow the money. They lie at the danger of living what they want to do, but following the money. But we know what that does. It takes away the spirit of everything that says something about who they are and what they ascribe to. Now, there is a problem. You're right. We seem to be just, teetering in the peripheries about this. But within communities, those initiatives come and they seem like, they're very good. But in fact, they're very prescriptive, tokenistic, and very extractive, like Rabab said. And they leave a lot of communities not wanting to engage. The practices of engagement are wrong. We as community leaders are left to pick up from where the damage has been done, and you try to regroup and continue with. So sometimes you find that grassroots artists or cultural practitioners sometimes don't engage with such initiatives because they don't work for them. In fact, they're damaging because they're embedded within a system that is exclusionary. It's exclusive. It keeps people at the outside rather than keeping them in. It does not acknowledge the richness that lies within. It ignores it. In fact, it says, if you don't do this, you won't get the money. So it's not working. And while they're good in their own way, those City of Cultures and all those other people and places, I think they're also rooted in a system that isn't working. And until that changes, those initiatives may end up start working for communities. And I just wanted to make a quick point that I think in order to shake the thing, if we can shake the whole system, it is important that all those involved in either gathering information or trying to our voices to be heard, to actually adopt empowering practices. For example, this podium, it's set around, it's been set up by an academic group, right? It should be empowering in its own way to open spaces like this for ordinary people, not for people who are probably, have been to university, but for the common people in the grassroots to engage them. So the practices of even finding information is also rooted in a place which is quite exclusive. It keeps people out. So another thing is, even the ways where we work should tell how empowering we want to be. Otherwise, what we're doing, even in the quest of trying to find solutions to this, is replicating the system that is actually keeping all of us out. And it means, communities in the end, we just end up having to just do what we need to do without this is, act outside of that system and continuously find ways to fund. It is hard, but it is the only way to remain true to our cultural practices within our communities.
Thank you, Dadirai. And Toby, I'm conscious that we are slightly over time, but do you have a short comment or rejoinder, something that you want to add to what Dadirai said?
I just wanted to amplify what someone said. Simon Taylor said we seem to have a problem with funding-led culture rather than culture-led funding, which kind of sums up how I feel, to be honest.
No, I noticed that comment too, because pretty much says it all, doesn't it? So thank you, Toby. So I think that unbelievably that we're already at the end of our event. It's gone really quickly, but there's lots more to read in the chat. So as I draw this event to an end, just wanted to say that all relevant links, slides, documents that the team is collating around this event will be sent around by email after the event. The chat will remain open for 10 minutes after we say goodbye, so you can continue other conversations, and we'll share contact details after the event for of those of you who opted to share their details, so that you can hopefully start some of the continue some of the conversations that have started today. And the organizers at the center are really key to point out that this series of events is just a starting point of a conversation, of a relationship. The center is keen for all of us to collectively work together to build a better understanding of the differences that culture makes to lives, communities, and also the those differences of power and recognition that have have come through so powerfully today. So this is just the beginning of the conversation. They're planning to do more events like this in the future, and to help shape these events, please can you take 5 minutes to complete the evaluation feedback form that they have now put a link for in the chat. So there's also, I see, a chance of winning a £50 book voucher in the prize draw if you fill in the survey. So one more reason to fill it in. So you will also you will receive a link to the survey if you press the leave meeting button. So I think that's all the housekeeping instructions from me. So thank you very much to our contributors for their generosity in sharing their perspectives, their experiences and expertise. And thank you very much to all of you for having attended in this large number. We all hope to see you at the other events. So bye for now, and thank you so much.